So many people who come to visit the Mütter Museum have never seen anything like our collection before and tend to think that it's unique. And it is somewhat unique now, but in the 19th century, and the 18th century for that matter as well, there were many museums similar to the Mütter dedicated to the sciences of anatomy and pathology. This is a period in which physicians are working out ideas about development, typical and atypical development of the human body, about the ways in which the body's parts fit together, and beginning in around the 1830s, really starting to think about what is happening during disease processes that they could observe during life at a patient's bedside, and how those disease processes corresponded to the structures inside the body, which could only be observed after death. This is before X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, it's before photography. And so the ways in which physicians were sort of trying to puzzle out these relationships between what they could see during life and what could be observed after death at autopsy was through the collection and preservation of specimens and the arrangement of those specimens in museums like the Mütter. And we often think now of museums as a place to go to have an emotional or as an aesthetic experience, but these museums should really be understood as three-dimensional classification systems, a place where physicians were bringing together their observations, the data, the evidence they were collecting, and grouping it and trying to understand the patterns that they were seeing. Remember, this is the way that they could share these observations with each other. And this was a very common mode of teaching, not just in medicine, but in anthropology, in natural history. University of Pennsylvania at one point had both a chemistry and a biology museum. So many of the sciences were using the idea of a museum as a place in which to organize, systematize, and share knowledge. This type of museum-based teaching starts to disappear around the 1930s. Really, in medicine, it's pretty much gone in pathology by the 1950s. And many of the museums that were once the Mütter's peer start to disappear. So in some senses, the Mütter is unique, but it's unique as a survivor. So the physicians who were organizing museums like the Mütter, roughly 1860 to 1930 to 1950, which is when these museums start to disappear, really believed in the teaching power of the real thing. They frequently called specimens nature's books. They believed these objects could be read by the trained eye, and that part of what they were attempting to do was to train the eye of a medical student or of a peer to see the pathological changes that were occurring in the organ. And really, this analogy of nature's books to physical books was also how they understood the relationship of a physical museum to a physical library. The two were complementary and had to exist together. But many physicians also saw the power of the real as a way to teach the public. So, for instance, anti-tuberculosis campaigns in the early 20th century would feature specimens of tubercular lungs for the public as a way to show the terrible nature of the disease and really make concrete for members of the public what was happening to the body. But it was really this belief in the power of the object to teach and to capture the imagination and to transmit knowledge that underpinned all of these types of displays, whether they were intended for the public or for a professional audience.
I am Giselle Mackler and the Collections Research Specialist at the Mütter Museum, and a large part of my role has been involved with collecting research that we had available to us at the museum, either in our archives or in our working files, and to really reconnect that to the human remains in the collection. One of the great things about the Postmortem Project is that it was allowing us to kind of take a moment and really assess what we had available and collecting patterns and maybe some information that over time, as computers became implemented into the database of any museum, maybe got disconnected from any paper files or the object themselves. Being able to reconnect that information is what's allowed us to tell the stories that we've been able to include throughout Postmortem. One of the things that I'm really proud of is being able to find that our archives actually hold much more information than we originally thought about what's held in the human remains aspect of the Mütter Museum's collection. A large part of the collection started with Thomas Mutter's donation that was officially added to the building in 1863, but we didn't have as much information in the museum office known to staff about the original inception of the museum in 1849 by a college fellow named Isaac Parrish. He started the collection in keeping in step with other institutions that had pathology collections, and we really were just the status quo in terms of a pathology and human remains collection at any medical institution or educational facility. We started with a catalog, we had patient records starting in 1849, and that's been a wonderful addition and something that we're really excited to reconnect with the digitization process and the human remains process. We've also been able to find that while we have a wonderful archival system that has been keeping a lot of these documents safe and available, the museum staff didn't exactly know how many documents we had that told us the story of the human remains. And so through the postmortem process, we've been able to make a complete list that tells us exactly what those documents are, what years they hold, where they're located, and in some cases, like the Hinsdale catalog, we've been able to do a high-resolution digitization of those and make them more available. These are documents that hold the names and the stories of many of the human remains, or they just tell us which hospital they came from, and they give us a starting point for the research process. In looking at the overall time frame of the museum's inception from 1849 to the present, we were able to look at acquisition patterns and found that we mostly accepted donations, but around 1863, when Dr. Mütter gave us a $30,000 endowment, which was the equivalent of $1.1 million at the time, for about 20 years, a large amount of human remains came to the collection through purchases, which is not something that was replicated later. Later on, as patients were able to get more agency through things like the 1974 National Research Act, we began to get living donors starting in the 80s up to about 2022.